class. Okay, I remembered.
I have a question. Did we have to like sign in to Zoom at first, or did it just automatically let us go into it?
If you have, just click on the link and you just get right in.
Because it's not letting me. It's wanting me to sign in.
Does anybody else have to sign in?
Mm-mm.
I mean, I do because I have to create the class. Don't know. You could jump in on Hannah's laptop if you guys want to be camera buddies or whatever.
I'll try it one more time.
If not, I'll put it there. Perfect.
Okay, so just broadly, I just want to ask the question, what did you guys think about learning about systematic reviews? Because our discussion of the last 2 weeks was kind of going here anyways. And so this is a new discussion for this year. We didn't have this discussion in class last year, but it kind of, the conversation went there. So I added the readings and I added all that stuff to it. And so just kind of curious what you guys thought about having a dedicated readings about it and the topic. Well, I guess maybe we should talk about the topic, but I don't know. You guys had really good comments about this. So I'm excited to talk about this today with you guys.
It was really helpful because it kind of lines everything up for you. So when you go ahead and do your work, you kind of know what's expected of you. That's what I liked about it.
Can you explain that again?
Are you not being able to hear me?
No, I can.
Good. Okay. It kind of sets you up so that you know what's expected of you when you're going to do your work. That's what I really liked about all of them, is it lays it all out for you. So when you go to do your work, it's there. You can go back and look at them and know what not to put in there, what really should be in there. It makes it all relatable.
So you have a systematic process to follow from the beginning as you're looking at evidence, basically.
Right. So you know exactly what really should be in there and what really doesn't need to be there.
Gives you some direction.
Exactly.
Yes, that's what it, yay. Okay, I'm glad that's what you got out of it, because that's what it's supposed to do. Again, every time I've done PowerPoint, the last couple of times in Zoom, it has not worked out to show my slide, do the slideshow or whatever. So I'm just going to do it like this. I realize that this is not the real way to use PowerPoint, but bear with me. And let's make sure that our chat is open so I can see the chat. Okay, so let's just do some broad learning about systematic reviews. The Coyle article does a really good job, I think, of explaining very succinctly what a systematic review is and kind of sort of how to do it. Not a ton of details about how to do it, but just basic information. And that article, the Coyle article, was published in AJRT, so American Journal of Recreational Therapy, so a practitioner-focused journal. What did you notice about the length of that article comparatively? It was a whole lot shorter, wasn't it? That's AJRT is meant to be short and sweet, and so I like that article as an example of, one, explaining what a systematic review is, but two, an example of one, but in a really short format. So the other two articles, the one that I wrote and the one that Hodges et al. Wrote, those did not go to recreation or rec therapy specific journals, and they were really more, they're, as much as they're geared for the practitioner, they went to places that weren't geared for practitioners, and so there's an expectation for longer articles, more writing, more information. Yeah, and that makes it a little bit harder to get through, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this lecture today is based off of a video webinar series, and I put the link to it down there on our little intro slide here. You're welcome to watch it if you have an hour and a half of extra time, but I have gone through it and distilled it down into 25 slides or something like that. It's really, really informative, so if you want way more detail than what I'm going to do in class, I recommend watching it. But I will say that the guy who's leading the webinar is not an easy guy to listen to. He's kind of boring, and English is not his first language, but he does well speaking, but he has all of these different styles of doing things that made it hard for me to follow along. So I tried to just distill it here, but it's a good webinar anyways, and he has a version of this PowerPoint in there. So this is the distilled version. So what influences a clinician's decision? So I don't just want to lecture this stuff. I put it up there so you guys can read it. I mean, I'm not doing my little animations on here, so all the information is up there, but I don't just want to like read off these PowerPoints. But we've kind of talked about this a little bit in this class so far about knowledge and what influences our knowledge. So think of it a little bit more specific to our job as a practitioner. What influences our clinical decisions? The answers are on the screen. So
clinical science dictates.
What was that, token mail? I'm kidding, Jake. What was that, Jake?
I was making a joke.
Oh, okay.
Continuing education and other in-service training.
Okay, so basically our training and experience, right? So we have all been trained as clinicians. We have internships, we have volunteer experience, we have paid employment, working with maybe the same population for a long time or a variety of different populations, and all of that informs our decision-making as a clinician, right? So if I spent 10 years working with veterans in adaptive sport, then I feel like I may have a good base of knowledge to then make future decisions in working with that population. An important thing to remember here is that it may not always be up to date. So some people are really good at staying like on that cutting edge of their practice knowledge, and other people are not. So let's say I've spent 25 years working with my population, but I do not attend conferences, I do not take classes, I do not read anything about my population, any current literature about my population. My techniques may not be cutting edge or even up to date. Everybody's techniques don't necessarily have to be cutting edge, but they should be up to date, right? I feel like cutting edge means it's like, I mean, how would you interpret cutting edge versus up to date in terms of knowledge?
Not just like, well, up to date would just be like the most recent, but cutting edge sounds like game changing.
Game changing, I like that.
Yeah.
Game changing, exactly. This is going to blow wide open the way that we work with this population. That's what I kind of think cutting edge means.
Sounds like research too.
Say that again?
Cutting edge sounds like research. So you're actually participating in research.
Yeah.
Then whatever you're trying can work.
I mean, if you're doing research that is either cutting edge or up to date, I mean, they both kind of feed into each other. You can't do, cutting edge research is not out of date. Not at all. So yes. There are some other examples in there of what that training experience could be: basic science, clinical science, didactics, clinical science practicum. So this is all pre-service stuff, training, and then CEUs and your accumulated expertise. Okay, so other influences on our decisions. So of course our patients' preferences, like I really do not want you to do this with me, or veterans may have preferences about what kind of aspects they want or elements they want in their programming, their rec therapy programming. And if somebody has done that study, hint, hint to a student in our class who's doing that study right now, then if that's published somewhere or not, even if they just explain that to us that we want this, that all influences. It's 6:17. Good evening. Sorry. It's my watch. I don't know. Everybody heard that? Mickey, thank you. Okay, so some other influences on our decisions. So healthcare system factors. I mean, let's not even get into the politics of Obamacare versus Trump care, but all of that is going to change. Whatever happens there will change how we practice, right? And all of that is influenced further by society and your organization's values, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so clinical research reports. This is probably what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, right? Evidence, primary studies. So a first study done in a certain area, or evidence-based practice resources, which are systematic reviews or critically assessed topics or clinical guidelines, kind of like a compilation of all of the knowledge in an area. And here's an article down there if you're interested to go read about it, more about what evidence-based practice is. Okay, so all of that comes together to influence our decisions as a clinician. But I wouldn't call all of it evidence, right? Would we call society and healthcare system factors evidence? Evidence to influence our decisions, or training and experience, or patient values and preferences? So what is evidence? How do you define evidence? Let's take a stab at defining evidence.
Facts.
Okay,
Things that actually happen that you have.
Things that have happened.
It's systematically proven over
Right.
and over and over again that yield the same results.
Okay. So a systematic process that produces similar or the same results. Facts. Any other ideas about what evidence is?
Maybe experience.
Yes.
So experience doing what you're studying.
Well, okay, so hang on to that one. And here's a definition of evidence. 1A there. An outward sign, so an indication or a token. So yes, I think your experience could kind of fall under that. Something that furnishes or tends to furnish proof, or a medium of proof, like testimony. Experience might, I don't know that experience produces proof, but maybe experience really falls under that first 1A definition element. And then, go ahead.
So in this instance, we can use the word proof, because before you said not to say that we prove anything.
No, we cannot use proof, but this is proof is part of the definition.
Okay.
Of it. So this is like from dictionary definition type of thing. But no, we don't say the word proof or proof. We do not offer proof. We support or refute. Yeah. Okay, so then the state of being evident, or clearness, which is weird. You can't use the word to define the word. So being evident, a state of being evident, I don't know. So this is really a broad definition of evidence. So how do we judge? So if this is what we're saying defines evidence, and we've listed kind of these influences on our clinical decisions, which may or may not be quote unquote evidence, although I think we could consider clinical research reports as evidence. How do we judge evidence? On what criteria do we do it? How do we judge whether it's good or bad? Well, we should have some criteria, right? Is this really small to you guys on your screen, all this text?
No.
Okay, it's super tiny on mine, so I will not blow it up then. All right, so there are kind of 3 elements to judging evidence. It has to be relevant, so we're looking for relevance to a certain topic. So evidence constitutes information for or against a specific proposition, or relevant to a specific clinical question. It just can't be random facts, right? It has to be focused and relevant to a specific topic. Sufficiency, so information needs to meet criteria for corroboration by other pieces of information on the same topic. So there can't be one thing that says this is how it works, or this is how it is, or this is my evidence for this thing. Just one thing isn't enough. There needs to be a sufficient amount to say that this is then evidence. And like what Jake said, there's got to be enough of it saying the same thing for it to also be kind of evidence. And this is where it gets at the veracity part. The process of information gathering has been free from distortion and, to the degree possible, uncontaminated by conflicts of interest. Sorry, that doesn't get at the similarity of the results, but it cannot be swayed or biased in any way. So these 3 elements weigh into judging the quality of evidence. Thoughts so far? I hope you guys are thinking about this all in the context of rec therapy research, right? Because we're going to be maybe just recreation-based research broadly, since we have such a small RT base of knowledge of literature, but still. All right. I'll tell you never to use Wikipedia, but this guy used Wikipedia in his presentation to come up with like a definition or explain what the burden of proof is. So if you're thinking of, when I was watching this webinar, I was thinking about lawyers, right? So who, when they go to trial, they have, their duty is to provide this burden of proof, right? Enough evidence to prove whatever happened. Okay, so we have all these levels kind of proof of something happening, and not all of these are equal to each other. So if we look here at reasonable suspicion, this is probably like the loosest level of proof, right? So I just kind of suspect that this is what's happening. Would you base a clinical decision off of something you suspect might be happening? Yeah. You shouldn't be. But how many of us or people we know do? I think this is what's happening in my program, so I'm just going to keep on doing it. I have no actual evidence of it. I've never collected data on it. But I think this is what's happening. So I'm just going to keep on doing it. I don't know. That's a little shady to me. Okay, so reasonable to believe, next level, probable cause. So you've weighed it in comparison to other actions or behaviors or outcomes. And so this is probably what's happening based on what I've seen in other areas. Some credible evidence, substantial evidence. Now, again, what that evidence is could vary, but there's some other evidence for it. So again, it's very easy to think of this in like lawyerly terms. So there might be, you know, blood drops, or I don't know, I'm totally thinking of O.J. Simpson here, but blood drops or knives or things like that. You know, if you're, where does that fall in here of some credible evidence, substantial evidence? Didn't they say there was a lot of circumstantial evidence with O.J. Simpson and convicting him? So none of that, it seemed like there was a preponderance of evidence, but none of that was enough to say he did it. So I would say maybe there was substantial evidence or some credible evidence. I mean, he wasn't convicted, so. Okay, preponderance of evidence, clear and convincing evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. So lawyers have to achieve beyond a reasonable doubt in order to convict. That's their challenge. And then beyond the shadow of a doubt would be kind of like that highest level of proof, the burden of proof. I don't know. If we had to use these criteria to judge our RT literature and like the outcomes that these things say, and we want to call that our evidence, how do you feel about using these as our criteria?
We wouldn't have criteria.
I know these are loosely defined, like the parameters around each one of those elements of proof is sketchy, debatable. I don't know, maybe there's more. I don't think that there is more definition of what is really considered a preponderance of evidence. Okay, so these aren't exactly the best elements for us to use to judge the evidence in our field or in research in general. So luckily there is a more systematic way to do it for literature, which is great. So evidence is, in terms of research, can be one single study of relevance, sufficient quality, and veracity, those three elements that we talked about first. Or it could be the body of all studies, again, of sufficient quality, relevance, et cetera, relevant to a single clinical question, preferably consistent, et cetera, and summarized qualitatively or quantitatively, which would be called a meta-analysis. You guys read an example of that. Okay, so now all of a sudden, when we're talking about evidence in research, there's a little bit more structure behind what is evidence. Okay, so it could be one study, That's got to be the most awesome study ever, to have one study be your evidence for this is how you do what you do with this client or this population. Or you can take a whole bunch of studies together. So the evidence-based process, the evidence-based practice process, ooh, say that 5 times fast. This is ideally how it should come together. We start with a question, right? What's the best diagnosis or treatment or assessment or whatever to use with this particular population? My goal is to produce this answer. I'm going to incorporate things like values of my organization or my own personal and professional values, the costs of whatever that is, some other considerations. What other considerations as a practitioner may we want to influence our decision on using a treatment, assessment, whatever.
We never had enough money for anything, so what resources you already have.
Exactly, what resources you already have. If we are, I mean, that kind of goes in the costs, but if we're never going to be able to buy something, and I do this review that says use this, this, and this, and that's totally not an option, is there a second best option that we, amongst what we already have? Sure, that would definitely kind of draw a box about what you can search for. Okay, so on the other side here, we would review our evidence for quality, quantity, variety. Somebody over here's got to mute. That was weird. We have to establish some criteria, though, on reviewing that evidence. That's what we're going to talk about today. And then that would produce our answer in terms of back to our question. Okay, this is the ideal process. Doesn't always happen this way, but this would be the best way to go about doing it. All right, so what's the definition of a review? An article or book published after examination of published material on a subject. So we read book reviews all the time, right? Sometimes they're really short, other times they're really long. Anybody ever remember doing book reports as like a kid in elementary school? That's a review to some degree. Okay. Anybody get a book report published or anything like that? Probably not, but yeah, we always need people to review RT textbooks, and those reviews get published in like TRJ and AJRT and things like that, and then it becomes knowledge for the practitioners out there, so that counts as a review. It may be comprehensive to various degrees, and the time range of material scrutinized may be broad or narrow, but the reviews often review current literature, okay? So we're not, depending on what your question is, when you review something, it may be all the potential knowledge ever with regard to that one thing, or it could be a slice of it, although you have to justify why a slice. So again, broad or narrow. This is why as we talk about your topics, we try to get the cleanest topic possible, because we don't want to have to do something where you have to review every single thing that's ever been out there on the literature. For some of your topics, that would be 50 years worth of evidence to review. I don't want to do that. I don't want to read that. I'm sorry. But the point being that it has to be comprehensive. So a lot of the feedback I gave to you guys as you were producing your TIS forms was to not limit your search and the search terms and databases that you use, because you could miss a lot of things and then it wouldn't really be a comprehensive review. So we have to do, as we produce reviews, make every effort we can to find everything we possibly can within the scope that we say, okay? We want it to be comprehensive and not just say, well, I searched all the RT journals. So we might not find very much there, but we cannot say that that's comprehensive. Yeah, so then the material that you review may be broad in topic or specific. Well, it should be specific to your topic, but it could encompass a lot of other things as well. So yeah, that's that last one. So that's a review. Okay, so, but again, there's no detail on how to do these reviews, and it's still broad enough in topic and scope that it kind of just flows wherever it wants to flow. And there's no criteria here keeping you in a defined area. So here's the definition of a systematic review. So does anybody want to read that first bullet point? Because I feel like I'm talking a lot. And I am happy to let anybody read it.
Systematic review.
It's just
Go ahead, Hannah. She had already started. Sorry, Jake.
Okay, a systematic.
token mail.
A systematic review synthesizes research evidence focused on a particular question and follows a priority protocol to systematically find primary studies, assess them for quality, extract relevant information, and synthesize it qualitatively or quantitatively.
All right, let's pick that apart. Well, let's go back really quick to this broad definition of a review. It may be comprehensive to various degrees, and the time range scrutinized may be broad or narrow, but most often desired are reviews of the current literature. So basically what this is saying is that all you're doing is current literature. A systematic review says evidence focused on a particular question that was established a priori, a protocol established before you even started. This is what I'm going to do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, relevant to this very specific topic, to find primary studies, assess them for quality, extract relevant information, and synthesize it. Ooh, there's kind of like 4 pieces right there, right? That previous definition of just broadly a review doesn't say really what you're going to do with any of that information. You're just going to review it. Well, review it for what? Are you making recommendations off of it? Is just knowledge to be gained? Who knows? Just spitting back in a summary of what it is. Think about it, what a book report is, right? You read a book and say, this is what it was about, and then your teacher knows that you read it, right? So that's not what a systematic review is. Somebody want to read point 2, bullet 2? Jake, go ahead, since you were the one who tried to cut Hannah off.
No, she tried to cut me off. Let's see. Systematic reviews reduce bias in the review process and improve the dependability of the answer to the question through the use of a protocol, extensive electronic and manual literature research, careful extracting of data, and critical appraisal of individual studies.
Thank you. I realize that text color is probably not awesome for you.
Yo, I'm wearing my glasses. I got this.
Okay. So again, a little bit more rigor, right, in what this process is than in what that general review process is. And I don't know, I see this and I think, how could you ever do the other kind of review and think that that was producing good evidence of anything? I don't think that it does. So all of this definition here looks like this in a process. Don't be overwhelmed by all of it. I just saw your face was like, ah. Okay. It is a lot. It's a very, very rigorous process. It is a step-by-step. You follow it to the T, and what it produces at the end is of such high quality that you could then say, based on these findings, do this, this, and this, and people should follow that. But you can't really do that with that other way of doing the review, the broad review, where you just get all the literature on something and then who knows what you do with it, right?
So this really shouldn't overwhelm you. The other way should overwhelm you because there's no paths or guidance.
There's no
This
path
is
or
your
guidance.
path.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's no path or guidance on that other way. You're just like, you're like a boat on the sea being buffeted by the wind, right? You go wherever, whatever takes you there. Oh, my interest all of a sudden, swayed this way. And so I'm going to start reading stuff here. And it's loosely related to the topic, but there's nothing to rein you back in, right? So this is meant to, well, one, keep you started on a very narrow path, and that if you start to like tread off the side of that path, it's going to yank you right back onto that path because you're off topic, or you have an advisor that says you're off topic type of a thing. But as long as you have a process to follow, it's really easy to see when you get off topic. So
Like
start
ducks?
down here at the bottom. Go ahead.
I said like ducks.
Exactly. Pull them all back in, right? We start at the bottom and work to the top. we have to have some questions. So we've been talking about this in classes. We've been coming up with our research ideas, something that is very focused, specific to a population and or an intervention. Okay, so if you want to further narrow things, you add more elements to that question. So I'm really challenging all of you guys to have a population and an intervention, and that helps narrow it. If you were to just leave it to broadly a population like autism spectrum, well, that's going to be a lot of literature to review. So add an element to it, and that focuses your question, narrows your topic already. So it is problematic to be too broad, because then you're reviewing bajillions of articles and you'll never get anywhere.
Jasmine, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if my topic is too broad, since it's not.
I did not think so when I read through it today.
You didn't think so?
No. And I remember, I'm thinking back, it's the administrator's perceptions of rec therapy and long-term care.
Yes.
No, I don't think it's too broad.
Okay. All right. I think I'm definitely gonna have to change my search terms because I didn't get much of substance.
Yeah, I think that was my feedback to you, right?
Yes,
That
yeah.
you didn't have much, so
Which is
you
funny
might,
because I thought the same thing. I was like, yeah, wasn't that great?
so it does take some going back and forth to kind of create that clinical question. But remember from, I don't know, a couple weeks ago that we were talking about this, most of what applied research is about is addressing a problem in practice. And so if you can keep that in mind as you're trying to create that question, if I have a problem in this area, well, I should be able to come up with a broad research question that would allow me to only search for literature that addresses that area, because all that other stuff isn't going to help me. Why read all that other stuff? Whatever's out there on that. Just read the stuff that's pertinent to what you're doing. Okay, so if we keep it specific to practice, that helps keep it narrow as well. Okay, so then we come up with this review protocol. And some of you guys commented about this in your discussion threads, that the Cochrane collection is a organization that collects and kind of houses systematic reviews, but they also can provide a process of, actually, I don't know if they're the ones who do it, but I think they do. You can register a review protocol and have it be peer reviewed. So our peer review in terms of academia and, well, not really academia, but within producing systematic reviews in class type things like this, is that I'm your peer review. So that you're going to tell me that this is what I'm going to do, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to say, okay, good. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And what about looking in this database? And what about, kind of all the feedback that I've been giving you guys? That kind of serves as a peer review process that would then help, broaden or narrow or whatever, but it's not just you coming up with an idea saying, this is how I'm going to find this information, and that nobody has input on that. So you come up with your process here. Generally, it's going to include all or most of these elements in the dotted line boxes. So inclusion and exclusion criteria these are your keyword searching terms. Abstract scanning criteria. So this is what you guys should be doing, maybe as part of that TIS form, but definitely as you're working forwards on the evidence table, is that the evidence table, you have to get the actual articles, but at some point you had to have started with an abstract, right? Read through the abstract and be like, yes, this is pertinent to me. I'm going to download this one, or read the abstract and say, nope, the title was good, but the abstract gives a little bit more details. It's not what I want. Okay, so we go through these are layers, right? First, we start searching with the terms. We pull all those abstracts. One at a time, we go through it and say yes or no. Then we get the full paper and we scan through that and we read it in details, and we may pull out information and put that into an evidence table, and which gives us a quick and easy way to look at all the information in an article without having to read the whole article all over again. But you have to have the full paper to do that. You cannot only review abstracts and think that that is enough to do a systematic review, because it's not.
It would be so funny in class, like a few semesters ago when we had to bring articles to class and summarize them.
And you could tell the people who only read the abstract because their summary literally sounded just like the
Exactly.
abstract.
And you can tell people who write by only reading the abstracts. So you got to read the whole article. Sorry. I think I said this maybe in seminar a couple weeks ago. You may skim articles for class, but you cannot skim articles for theses, dissertations, projects, or any actual writing that you want to get published. We can see right through that. All right, so then there might be a quality checklist or rating scale, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So how do we really know? Everything looks good. This looks like a good study, but how do I really know that this is a good study? Can I give it a score? And then if, you know, any article that scores below this is not good enough, you know, I'm not calling that quality evidence. So there's lots of different rating scales that we could use for that. Extracting forms and instructions. So again, this protocol is kind of specific to medical systematic reviews, so that I think is a step that's specific to that and not really pertinent to us. Although if you were reviewing a protocol for a certain rec therapy intervention and there were forms or instructions that go along with how you do things, you might want to extract that type of stuff. So then over here on this, these last two elements, this synthesis rules or procedures, and then evidence grading scheme. So this also goes to, this is what gets peer reviewed. So you can see this little peer review box up here. So when you do your systematic review protocol and you want somebody to review it, they're going to review these two steps mostly, is how you're going to synthesize things and how you're going to grade that evidence. That's what these two elements here are. Okay, so these are your steps of your systematic review protocol. This is the actual doing of it in this little pinkish box. Okay, we scan our papers. We do some type of assessment on the quality of those papers. We extract the data. You may put it in something like an evidence table. Data synthesis and meta synthesis. And this is really tiny on my screen, I apologize. Look up here. So this is the analysis part of doing a systematic review, and then making some type of conclusions or recommendations based on synthesizing all of that together. So some other information up in here in terms of collecting the data. So you may contact authors, expert inquiries. So if you're studying, I don't know, something really specific, yoga as it pertains to people with Parkinson's, you might want to call and talk to Marika and see if she, you know, let's say you find all of her articles on yoga and rec therapy, or you find a couple, but you think, man, there's probably more than this, but I can't find them anywhere. You could email her and say, hey, I'm doing a review on yoga and rec therapy, and I found these articles, but I feel like there's something missing. Is there any more that you're aware of? And she may say, yes, look at this, this, and this. It's always okay to try to contact authors. And in one of the articles you read, or in two of the articles that you read, authors were contacted and said, do you have anything? And they did offer other things. That won't always happen, but you can always try. If we're trying to be comprehensive, that would be one way, right? To be comprehensive in finding the information. What is ancestor searching? Anybody have any ideas of what that is?
Looking for older articles?
Yeah, but how are you finding those older articles?
Oh, through like textbooks and stuff.
Nope.
What
Close.
Looking through the
Reference page.
Yeah.
How many of you guys read the reference page? I totally do. I never used to, but I love reading the reference page. Sometimes as I'm reading through articles, they'll say, you know, so-and-so 2012 said this, this, and this. And I'm like, whoa, that's really interesting. And so I'll go down to their reference page, find out who those people are, and then I'll pull that article. So I can actually read the whole article instead of the one sentence they provide about that article. So that's ancestor searching. You can find a lot of other good literature that is specific to your topic out of the reference pages.
I have a note on that, just a second. When I had to do my annotated bibliography for the research methods class, that's how I found it easiest to find similar or similarly related articles on my topic. I would spend hours like doing the search on the library, going through all the articles, and then I was like, why am I not looking at the references because they're all interrelated? And that's how I got a lot of my articles for that. So it was really helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, we're being comprehensive, right? So we have to find every way to find this information. We can't just do one way. And a reference page is a really good place. Now, you can't only look at the reference page of your articles, but it's a good place. And I always find useful stuff. Journal hand searching. This is the most tedious thing ever. And I had to do this once for one of my assistantships way back in the day as a master's student, where I was working for a guy who was starting a project, and he's like, I just need to find literature, but I want you to search these journals from, he gave me like a 10-year period and a topic, and I just basically had to go through the hard journals and go article by article to see if, because none of them were digital, and luckily he had all those articles, or all those journals, like hard paperback. Oh my gosh, that took me forever. And seriously, it was like 10 years worth of journals, 4-ish publications per year, issues per year, 8 to 10 articles per issue. And I just had to have this topic and look on each and every one. And we only pulled a couple out of that. So out of 40 issues-ish times 8-ish issues or articles. Assistantship, you do what your advisor tells you, right? And you just smile and nod your head. Okay. Communicate with study authors. Oh, sorry, this is where you can contact the authors to find out more information. Expert inquiries, this is where you can kind of put together a panel, of, let's say you're doing a specific, again, yoga. You don't just want to rely on only Marika, but you do Marika and Abby and Heather and whoever and all these people who have all published on yoga, and you put something together and say, what do you think about this? And I think one of the articles did that. The Hodge article, she put together, she did her initial search and then found some things and sent it out to experts in the family leisure field and said, what do you think about this? And then they all weighed in, and that further refined her next level of searching. So again, expert inquiries. Okay, so what do you think about this process? Are you guys freaking out like, oh my gosh, it's so much, so many steps? No? Not so bad?
I think it's thorough.
Systematic review for their paper in this class? What was that?
I think it's thorough, which is good. I mean, you almost don't want it too easy because then it's not going to be taken as seriously. So
thorough is a good word because it has to be. We're trying to be comprehensive. We're trying to be rigorous. So, I mean, you can't skip steps. And when you're trying to collect a body of evidence to then say, this is how it's done, it has to be, you have to do a good job.
And we want to be taken seriously.
And I feel like in opposition to an actual, like conducting your own research project, this, you don't necessarily have to have a specific timeline. It's something you can do at your own pace if you don't necessarily have the time or resources to go out and conduct your own study. This is something that you can do over time. Like you said, that you did yours for 7 years. Is that right, Jasmine? Yeah. So it's like one of those things that you're still contributing, but it's not something that you necessarily be like, oh, I have 8 weeks to do this.
Yeah.
And then, so.
Well, so some insight into that one that you guys read that was written by me and Marika and one of my other colleagues, Raymond. The reason it took 7 years is because it was in review for 3 of those 7 years. So it took me about a year to find all of the articles, read all of the articles, kind of do all of this up to data extracting. So database searching, abstract scanning, full paper scanning, quality assessment, data extracting. It took me about a year to do that while I was doing my first year of my PhD. So it's not like I was spending all my time working on this. I wasn't. It was in between classes and all that type of stuff. And then it took me probably 6-ish months to do the analysis part of it. Now I've gathered all of this data. I have to like synthesize it all and crunch it all in my mind. These are not numbers that I'm crunching. This was a whole different type of analysis that took a long time. And then I had to start writing about it. So then it took me a really long time to write that paper. And that thing was like 45 pages long. And Marika kept saying, it's got to be shorter. It's got to be shorter. I'm like, and it's all important information. I can't cut anything, you know? So you guys are going to go through that experience likely as well. So it took, there were phases where I was working on it furiously and then phases where I was not. And that's, you know, while I'm doing a PhD. So a systematic review is a big project, but like you said, you're not constrained to having to collect that data in like this period of time. And so also I undertook a rather large review. I did review every single piece of literature that was ever published on that very specific topic. You don't have to necessarily do that type of, you know, comprehensive. We want it to be comprehensive, but there was the core and balance model that I reviewed has only been around for about 20 years. And so I could theoretically get all of the literature on it. Where in some of the other topic areas that we study, it would be impossible to get all of the literature. So you wouldn't necessarily spend a year trying to find it because you're not going to find it all. Okay, so you can give yourself more of a timeline to produce something like this and still, but the only thing I want to correct on what you said, Holly, is that this is still conducting a study. This is still research, okay? So when you say, yeah, I do research, and people are like, well, what kind? You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pre-post, like with a experimental design and a control group and all that. This counts as research. What I produced was a qualitative study. So I did a qualitative synthesis. The other article, the Hodges article, was a quantitative synthesis, so a meta-analysis. Mine was a meta-synthesis, so qualitative and quantitative. So one of somebody's questions was like, aren't these the same article, or did these come out at the same time, or one builds off of the other? They were at the same time. We were working on those articles at the exact same time. They were submitted to the same journal at the same time, to the same issue, actually a special issue on family leisure. And so all of that happened at the same time. Where was I going with that?
Is research a study saying that?
I was going somewhere with that.
Yeah.
Someone asked if they were the same thing. Is that where you were going, trying to differentiate?
Yeah, they're not the same thing. Qualitative versus quantitative. Same topic, two sides of a different coin, right? She did the quantitative analysis. So she got the data sets from all those people. If she couldn't get the data set, she got their article that had their numbers in it. And she took those numbers and recrunched those numbers. I didn't do anything with numbers. I took all of that information from many of the same articles. She had a few articles different than mine, but many of the same stuff. And I took a different analysis approach to it. So no numbers. So but both of them count as systematic reviews.
Is one like perceived as being better?
What do you think? Out of these two, the Townsend study and the Hodges study, which one do you think would be considered more, I don't know the word, desired more or whatever, or more credible?
Yeah.
It's okay if you say it's not mine, like don't feel bad.
No, it's the weird thing. It's like I feel, and I posted that in the discussion, that like the Hodge one was so hard to read, so hard to get through, and yours was actually like, it was well written and it flowed so well, and it was much easier to understand. But like I feel like the data may make that one perceived as being better. Would that be the case?
Which one?
The
The data, hers? They had two different goals. So and I'm not saying this because I want mine to be taken seriously or anything like that. I think that they were meant to review basically the same literature, but offer two different kind of perspectives on it. But the recommendations like some of the recommendations or the overarching outcome was the same. Family leisure matters
Yeah.
to family quality of life.
See, and I feel like if I were to do a systematic review, I would prefer doing a qualitative one. It just seemed I preferred both the COIL and yours to the Hodge one. So I just wonder, if it's seen as
Some
being as
people
credible.
do not like qualitative research. They don't think it's rigorous enough.
Yeah.
They don't think it's methodical enough. But I will say that my qualitative piece was not the same type of qualitative work as what is strictly like, or traditionally qualitative, where you're doing interviews and things like that. I didn't do that.
Yeah.
I was qualitatively reviewing quantitative evidence, if that makes sense. I didn't perform any interviews. None of the studies in my thing were qualitative with interviews or anything like that. I didn't have to come up with themes or categories or do all this coding or anything like that. All I was doing was synthesizing new knowledge to create new knowledge. She was quantitatively synthesizing it. And so I don't think one is better than the other. I think they both are necessary to have a good understanding of the literature about family leisure. And they produce two different outcomes. So mine produced a refinement of a model saying, this is what the original model looked like. Now with all of the evidence we have to date, this is what it should look like.
Yeah.
But it took reviewing all of it and talking about in a more qualitative manner the strengths, the weaknesses, what's the future direction that we should take it, to refine that model, where hers was more take all these numbers and do effect sizes. And so I just said, words that are coming out of your stats class. And so if you haven't been there in stats class yet, you might not understand. But effect sizes are like measuring the magnitude of impact of something. So she's looking at the magnitude of impact of family leisure on kind of family, very broadly, family well-being or family quality of life.
Well, and
two different sides of the same coin in terms of understanding family involvement.
yeah, do you feel like someone practicing, full-time working, like clinical practitioner I just feel like if you gave them those two articles, that they're more likely to read yours, just because rather than sit there and be like, have to think about all this data, and I would rather just have someone tell me.
But if they're going to ask for money to fund their program, they're going to use hers.
In the other article when we talked about levels,
because they want numbers for funding. Sorry.
It wasn't like a level, like the qualitative or the quantitative higher level, like it perceived as like you're supposed to do quantitative. So like, would they not approve something because it's qualitative?
What do you mean? What not approve? What do you mean?
Like,
who's they?
Well, if you were both publishing, like would they pick hers over yours? Like if they had to pick one?
They who?
When you're trying to publish
a journal?
Yeah.
Depends on where you are trying to get it published.
Okay.
So some journals don't want qualitative work and they only want quantitative stuff.
So for the rec therapy journal, would they?
So if we had both submitted either one of those articles or both at the same time to like Therapeutic Recreation Journal, they would have published either one. AJRT probably would have published neither of them because they're not written towards practitioners. So it's not really even about levels. It's about readership. But there are some journals that will only publish qualitative literature. There are some that will only publish quantitative. And so that might dictate how you do a systematic review too, if you want to get it published, and depending on where you want it to be in terms of how you produce that. But it's a whole different process analysis-wise to produce a meta-analysis than it is to do the meta-synthesis, is what I did. Okay, so let's keep going because we'll talk a little bit about that process in the analysis side of things. And then we'll go look at those articles and kind of see the steps that we both took.
So the steps we just looked at for either one, an analysis and synthesis?
Yep. Although your data synthesis and meta-analysis, this box right here, is totally different. The actual doing of that step is different depending on which one you choose. But all the other things, the process is exactly the same. So if in our two articles, as you read through the methods section, we had very similar search strategies in terms of databases, contacting authors, all that stuff. That's all in these boxes, and it's the same no matter which one you do, which process you take. It's just out here in the synthesis analysis section, what you're producing there is different. Good questions.
I was curious reading both of them. Are there like templates of how to organize your like finished product? Like, you know, because some of them will have like where you read this side and then you read this side. The other ones you'll just read.
Like,
So I think like in general, like, because when you're making like a research paper, the way you format, however you type it up or how it's published, like are there templates for that, or do you just?
Well, in terms of like introduction, lit review, methods,
Yeah.
results, discussion, yes, there's a template for that.
Yeah.
But in terms of what it actually looks like in the actual article,
Yeah.
Whether it's 2 columns or whatever, that's all depends on the journal formatting. So that's out of our hands.
Okay.
So like 2 skinny columns on a page or
Yeah.
1 big fat column on a page, that's not up to us. Why do you like one way or the other over the other?
Yeah. I like the 2 columns.
I'll make sure to tell them that next time. Like, Abby Wiles says that it needs to be 2 columns.
I guess it like doesn't like stress me out as bad looking at it because it's like, oh, there's sections.
Yeah.
Instead of like the whole page has all the words on it.
No, but you know, this is where when you get into writing, understanding scholarly writing, you do have kind of 5 main areas you have to cover: intro, lit review, methods, results, discussion.
Yeah.
And so those are all headings, and then under that there are subheadings that help organize and structure all of your results.
Mm-hmm.
And so there, to some degree, there is a template with that, but then your headings really change from paper to paper, topic to topic.
Yeah.
Beyond those 5 main headings. Okay, so we need to determine, once we've gathered all of our evidence, we have to determine the quality of it. So looking at each individual study, how do we go about determining whether there's something we want to keep or chuck it? We want to look at the research design. Is it a randomized controlled trial with crossover, whatever, historical controls, a pre-post study, a single subject design, whatever. There's a bazillion different designs, right? And it's all okay to include as long as you establish what the criteria is for inclusion, okay? Other things that we can look at, if a power analysis was done, sorry, I keep rolling over my power cords here and all these cables. Quality of the outcome measures, so if somebody's using like Bob's depression inventory, that's my go-to random, you know, but there really is like Beck's depression inventory or the PHQ-9, whatever. So if you know that there are very established, standardized, validated instruments used to measure certain constructs and certain outcomes, and you read these articles and it's using like Bob's depression inventory, I would say, no, not going to keep that one. They got this off the random tree, and this, I can't trust any of the results that it produces.
So if they all have different ones, you just pick the one you believe worked the best, or?
No, there's criteria,
Okay.
and that is just basically it has to be standardized, validated.
Okay, but what if they all have 4 different, like if we see 4 of them and they're all standard, do we do all of them? Sorry, this might be too in-depth.
No, it's not too in-depth. Say your question
So they
again.
they're all using different assessments. Do we just use them all?
Are they all trying to measure the same outcome? Let's say
Yeah, let's say they all are.
let's
Like
say they're
different-
all trying to measure depression.
Yeah,
and they
there's
all
different
use
assessments.
different assessments, but they're all validated and standardized. You can include all those. But
Like sometimes the assessments aren't appropriate, like Beck's, for example. It's a 21, is it 21 questions? And then, yeah.
off the
it's
top of my head,
really long.
21 items is not very big.
For an acute setting, sometimes though it's not. So like my point though was sometimes the assessments aren't appropriate for the population in this setting, like for the population, but not necessarily this setting. So, right?
You can, so can you, I think that you would have to read about why they chose that. Hopefully they explained why they chose a certain instrument. Because if it isn't inappropriate, then it's inappropriate, and you wouldn't necessarily want to include that because there's a reason it's inappropriate. Maybe it's contraindicated for that population, or because it's so long and they come in acute and they give it to them the first, within the first hour that they get there, they're not psychologically in a place where they could give
21 answers.
or,
whatever.
one legit answer, let alone 21 good answers, right? And so you would review that article and say, when did they administer this, and oh, within the first hour of arrival, well, this is totally inappropriate to give that population. Therefore, they likely had some weird skewed results that maybe are unexplainable or whatever. And so that's criteria that you can use. You know, the instruments are standardized, validated, and appropriate for the population based on clinical expertise or clinical insight. So if you think that that's inappropriate and you don't want to include that, you can't, but you have to be able to explain that and justify that in your review, in your write-up.
Maybe not say that it's inappropriate, but that there might have been a better choice or a better option.
You would say something more along the lines of instruments were, you know, articles were excluded if they used instruments that were contraindicated for certain populations based on, you know, you got to use all that terminology.
Yeah.
So you would write that all down in your review, how you your criteria that you had.
Why you included things and why you didn't include things. So both of that, all of that was in all three of those articles. Okay, and so it's based on all of these criteria here. So, you know, gosh, there's so much that we can talk about. I don't want to go into too crazy of a detail because some of this stuff doesn't really apply to what we do. Well, it does apply, but how many of our rec therapy studies that you guys have read have blinding in them? Do you know what that means? Blinding?
Isn't that where it's like the people doing the study don't know who's in what group?
Yeah, there's various levels.
Yeah.
So the interventionist, so the person delivering the intervention, doesn't know if you're control group or experiment group. The subjects, patients, clients themselves don't know what treatment they're getting. The person measuring the outcomes doesn't know, and your statistician doesn't know. So it's all blind. So that's like quadruple blind. Nobody knows, and that's because knowledge to some degree can bias reactions, right? I don't know very many, I'm trying to think of, do you guys know of any research in rec therapy that does blinding? Have you ever read any?
No.
If we're doing applied research, if you're doing a study in practice with your patients, can you determine who gets the treatment and who doesn't get the treatment? How could you do that in practice?
Could you? Based on like billing and stuff, like funding, you couldn't like take away their treatment, could you?
You can't take away treatment. There's ethical issues
Would you do
concerned with
delayed
that, right?
treatment?
What's that?
Delayed treatment with them?
You could do delayed treatment because you're not denying them treatment. They're just going to get it later.
You
So,
could
but it's not
you
blind.
can alter the treatment.
Okay, so explain that more, Jake.
So say, I don't know, what was the example you were using, like, of the treatment?
Let's just say yoga is the treatment.
Okay, so you give certain people these exercises or these positions that you know will benefit them better, and you give these other people different ones that you know do not have as great of an effect. So they're still getting treatment, but it's not the same.
Well, so depending on what you're trying to accomplish in the study, you could potentially be biasing your results because they're not getting the quote unquote intervention as the yoga intervention, but they're getting some type of activity. And so that could be a confounding element to it, right? So it's not nothing. If you're trying to understand the impacts of a yoga intervention, you want to be able to compare that to people who don't get the intervention. But if you give them something like the intervention that might be good, because physical activity we know is good, so we're going to have you walk around a track while these guys do yoga. You're not really comparing yoga to no yoga. You're comparing yoga to walking around a track. You know, so you have to be careful on the people who don't get the intervention what is happening to them while the people who are getting it are getting it, right?
Well, everyone's getting the intervention, just not everyone's getting the same. This Everyone's getting the same intervention. Not everyone's getting the same aspects of the intervention.
It still would be a confounding issue.
But what if you didn't know what the results would yield, so you were just doing an experimental study?
It still would be a confounding issue. And here's the reason why. So let's say the group that gets yoga, we're looking at the impacts of yoga on flexibility of people who have broken their back. Okay. And so they have a standard yoga, 8-week yoga intervention where they go 3 times a week for an hour to yoga. And then you have this other group of people who've also broken their back, and they're not getting yoga, but they're getting gentle stretching. Okay. And so similar moves, but it's not the intervention, right? Let me know if I'm following what you're describing.
No.
Okay.
Everyone's getting yoga.
He's saying like
Some people are getting these specific yoga techniques. Some people are getting different specific yoga techniques.
but that's a nice
Okay, so I see what you're saying. So when you do a study, everybody has to get the same thing. And so, or when you're reviewing a study and you're reviewing what people have gotten, they all have to have received the same intervention. So if this group does downward dog and warrior positions, and this group does inverted something and help me out. And what? And
Flying
wheel.
lotus.
Exactly. I sound like I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so it's yoga. It's both yoga, right? But wheel and inverted things are way different, I'm assuming, than downward dog and warrior poses, right?
Like warriors versus inversion.
Yeah. So as soon as you start to change, so they're really not getting the same intervention. They are getting the same intervention if all you do is call it yoga. But in terms of like the differences between all of that, when we start to measure their flexibility and range of motion, we could have like wildly different outcomes. And we wouldn't be able to explain whether or not that was because these people got inverted things and these people didn't, or what. And so that's why when you're reviewing articles, when you're coming up with your own stuff, and you want to look at the impacts of something, it's better to compare to people who have had the intervention to people who have not had the intervention.
Okay, I have a completely different scenario. Since I'm looking at...
Hold on, time out.
Okay.
Let me finish Jake's thought before we go forward. I think somebody... time out really quick. I think somebody may have logged into our Zoom and it's going to kick us out of class really quick. Hang on a second, guys.
Perfect time for that 5-minute, 10-minute break.
Okay, before I click on this button, Jake, I want you to finish the thought that you had, and then when we come back, Gina, we'll do your thought. But finish yours.
I was gonna say that, even though everyone could be getting the same intervention, there's still some kind of not bias, but whatever the term I'm looking for is. Sorry, my brain's fried for working so freaking much. Some people, you said some people have back injuries, but the severity of the back injury, where the back injury occurred, like all these things are different factors. Even though they're all getting the same treatment, everyone's going to have a different outcome.
Yes.
So that's all I had to add.
Okay. All right, we'll take a pause and I'll figure out what's going on here. If you guys come back and class has disappeared, you might have to log back in.
Can we have like 10 minutes so I can eat some food? I'm really hungry.
Yes.
Sounds like
7:27, guys.